Hello all, I hope this finds you well. Thank you to Stephanie for leading us in our worship this morning. Uh, Give us a wave in the comments section when you find your way over here. Say good morning. Lovely day. I hope you've all had a wonderful week and that you've been, well, there's not been much sunshine this week, but there has been today, so hopefully you'll be a little better. Excited to see some people pop across. Do give us a wave in the comments, say hello when you're over this way. We're going to be speaking, I'm going to be speaking, morning Stephen, I'm going to be speaking mostly from Matthew's Gospel this morning, if you want to have your finger in what we're talking about today. So we're going to be there, and I might start just by reading that passage again, if I can find it here somewhere. So it's Matthew 11, and it's 16 to 19, and then verses 25 to the end. But to what will I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to one another. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. At that time Jesus said, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent, and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you that are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Well, good morning to everybody on the comment section. I almost said Twitter. We're not on Twitter though. Get my social medias all muddled up. Good to see everybody coming across. Well, a little while back, I was chatting to one of my American friends, someone I trained with at college, and he was telling me a story about his 10th wedding anniversary. And he had decided to take his wife to New York, I think, and to one of the best restaurants that he knew there. And as they entered, they were sat down at the table by the waiter and presented with these wonderful menus. And as they were sat there, browsing through the menus, deciding on what to order, my friend is quite a people watcher, so he had a look around the restaurant. And he looked at one of the tables opposite him, and he noticed these two gentlemen. And then to my friend's amazement, he realized that one of the men sitting at that table was none other than Bruce Springsteen, a personal hero of his. So he, overexcited, it took him about 5 minutes, but he mustered up the courage to walk over to Bruce Springsteen and get his autograph. So he walked over, he apologized for the interruption, and he explained that it was their wedding anniversary. And he asked if Bruce would be kind enough to write a message for them. And Bruce apparently smiled and kindly agreed. He wrote them a short message, and he signed it off for them. My friend thanked him. He apologized again, and then very smugly walked back to his own table. And then the time came for them to get the bill. And so my friend called the waiter over. He pulled him over, and he asked for the bill. And the waiter responded by saying, not to worry, you don't need to worry at all. Bono has actually paid your bill. And my friend was amazed. He was like, how did Bono know it was my wedding anniversary? And why has he paid my bill? And he looks all around the restaurant trying to find Bono. And then he glanced back at the table with Bruce Springsteen on it. And he looked with his jaw on the floor. as he realised that the gentleman who was eating with Bruce Springsteen was none other than Bono himself. Now, he obviously felt quite embarrassed because he had walked up to that table, being completely fixated on one thing, and not even realising who was in front of him, who was sat there. And had Bono not have done the deed of paying for the meal, then they would have never have known actually who was in the restaurant with them. Now, Bono isn't the Messiah, and he's not a naughty boy either, for those of you who are Monty Python fans. But what's going on in this morning's gospel passage is somewhat very similar, because the Pharisees, they don't know who they have standing in front of them. They are so fixated on what the Messiah will look like, who he will be, what he will look like in their minds, that he is stood right in front of them and they miss him completely. Not only that, but they missed God's prophet beforehand. They have such a view of what things are going to look like, what's good to them, what their hero is going to be like, that they miss Jesus. And it's because they've become indifferent to God. We read in this morning's passage that they neither celebrate the arrival of Jesus, like the children with the flute playing the dance. That was actually something that Jews would do for wedding celebrations. They would play the flute and they would dance. So that what's going on in this morning's passage is they're saying, actually, Jesus is saying, when I've arrived, you've not celebrated as you should do. This is like a wedding moment. You should know what's going on here. And for a completely different excuse, they miss John for completely the opposite reason. They think John, because he looked a bit funny and didn't eat and drink well, he's not a prophet in the way that looks like a prophet to them, perhaps, or what they think is going to look like. They miss both of them. And the other excuse for, of course, missing Jesus was the fact that he did eat. So John didn't eat. They didn't think he was anything to do with God. Jesus does eat, and they don't think he's anything to do with God. They have such a specific view on who this Messiah is going to be that they miss him completely. They miss God moving. And ultimately, in many respects, it's going to be through wisdom's deeds, as Jesus says in this morning's passage. And ultimately, for the Christian narrative, that's going to be the dying and rising of Christ, the death and resurrection of Jesus. That shows us who God really is. And it's by those deeds that we know our bill is paid for us. But the Pharisees, there and then, they stood in the presence of Jesus, knowing that they have the opportunity to know him there and then, to act on God's presence in their lives in that moment. And just to touch on the Genesis reading this morning, I think one of the most beautiful things that we see in this reading from Genesis is that Rebecca sees and knows God's handiwork when it appears in her life. Her obedience in this situation is somewhat amazing. Now, of course, I'm not saying that we should all run off with strangers if they approach us and invite us to go away and get married. In this day and age, that's obviously not a safe thing to do. In that day and age, it might not be a safe thing to do either. But there is something in the story, like Rebecca, that we should all learn to discern God's presence in the things that are happening around us. When God is speaking and moving, we need to see him in front of us and actually learn how to act, because it's the best thing for us. It's the place that we find peace. It's the place that we find rest. If we go opposite to what God wants for us, I spoke about this a couple of weeks back, about my ordination story. If we go the other way, we find that we come to a place that isn't restful. It doesn't sit well with our soul. But to walk in obedience with God is that place where we find rest, that place where we find peace. And turning back to this morning's gospel passage, we see that the Pharisees, they don't quite get it. They're not a restful bunch. And in fact, a lot of Israel wasn't restful at that time. They were in utter turmoil about what was happening in their country, what was happening in the world around them. They were looking for specific ways out of their problems. They thought that they knew how the solution to all their problems, to the Roman occupation, to all the oppression that they faced, was going to be a military leader. They thought it was going to be in some amazing celebrity, in some respects, who stood up and fought the Romans, and it was all about pride and Israel being the best and everybody else knowing that they're the best because there's this great military leader and he's strong and mighty. Now, of course, we know that God is strong and mighty, but the other thing that we need to hold in tension with God's kingdom is that the way to God's kingdom is not through might and pride in our own lives. It's not through earthly pride. It's actually through gentleness and through humility, through peaceful ways, through having compassion on those we see in the world around us, to have an outward view on life. That's the way to find God's kingdom. It's not going to be found in our own strength. And there are some who get it, both in those days, but all the followers of Jesus, whether you were in first century Israel or whether you are now a follower of Jesus, and you know him to be the person that the scriptures speak of, and you know him to be the Messiah, then now, for all of us, there is this great invitation. And the great invitation is simply this: to come and find rest for our souls, to be brought into the presence of Jesus, to find rest for ourselves despite the world around us. And what an amazing message for the times that we are in, times when actually a lot of the world is in turmoil. There's a lot going on in the world around us. There are lots of solutions. We have lots of situations where people think there are going to be celebrity political leaders or who might lead us out of our problems. They're not going to lead us out of our problems if they celebrate their own might and their own strength. The way of God's kingdom is gentleness and humility, to simply be able to know his presence with us. Now, of course, there are things that need to happen to find the ways out of all the problems that we find ourselves in at the moment. But we're not going to find them in our own strength. To be able to sit back, know God's wisdom, to have God's wisdom, and to follow through in obedience on those deeds, that's going to be the way that leads us all to peace. And we see that image in this morning's reading. I think it's a fairly familiar passage to us all, this come to me all you who labour and are heavy laden, and you will find rest. There's lots of varying translations of it, but they all go around that sort of central image, and we see the image of the yoke, which was a wooden beam, and you would use it in the old days, and probably still in some places today, to tie two oxen together so that they could work as a team. I often had that image in my mind as that when I read this passage. But what we need to know is that the words after are just important. That bond between the two ox is not just so that the two share the load, but it's so that they learn. You see, you'd have one experience. The way you do this is you'd have one experienced ox, and then you'd have one who's not so experienced, and you'd put the yoke across them. And by doing that, both oxen, the less experienced oxen, would learn from the more experienced oxen. It would change its patterns of behavior as it was yoked to the more experienced, and it would learn how to plough the fields. And I think there's a couple of things that you can say about this, but I think key is that learning and that changing. And also, I think, look, we need to respect that the weight of the work, of the labour, doesn't change. It just becomes lighter as the oxen learn to carry the weight. And in many ways, I think that's what Jesus is saying to us this morning. We can have all this weight in the world, but I have a way. I have a way for you. I am the way. If you were reading John's Gospel, might be the way. Obviously, Andy Brown is not the way. And when I say I am the way, Jesus is the way. But he has a different way of living. It's not about celebrity. It's not about being the best. It's not. It's about gentleness. It's about humility. It's about peace. And it's about us learning from God. It's about us knowing whose presence we are in, and that actually, if we listen to God, and that if we actually are obedient to his ways, then we will find rest, and we will find peace. That's the invitation that Jesus offers us this morning. It's what Rebecca did in this morning's reading. She was obedient to God, and through it, Isaac found peace and comfort, and she found peace with what was going on. And I appreciate that for all of us, it's not always comfortable learning and changing. We always like the safety of what we know and perceive as good. We can sometimes always preach for myself first. We can all think that what we know is good. But God is calling us constantly forward, calling us to be a people that learn and change in order that we might find peace and rest, in order that we might find him. And this is a journey that we all need to make. So this week's challenge for all of us is, I want to pose to you, is what is weighing you down at the moment? How is the world weighing you down? And actually, are you coming to Jesus with it? Or are you trying to go your own way? Are you able to come into the presence of God, meet him, and be prepared to spend time learning from him to carry that weight? Do you know whose presence you are in? And can you follow? That's this week's challenge from me. Do stick around. I'm about to finish, but in a very short while, Jess will be with us at 11:30 in about 5 minutes' time. So you've got a quick 5 minutes to go and make yourself a cuppa before she's up, and then at 11 o'clock we'll be back on the Zoom chat for those of you who want to join us there. Hopefully we'll see a lot of you there. Otherwise, we'll see you all soon. It was good to be with you this morning. Hopefully the church is open Mondays and Thursdays at the moment. We hope to see some of you there. Do come and make use of that space at the moment. We've set it up as a place of peace and a place for people just to be, a bit of an oasis in the desert in some ways at the moment. So do come and make use of the building. Be good to see some of you there. But do stick around. Jess is coming up very shortly. Bye for now.